welcome you all to the 34th lecture in the Democracy Dialogue series. This is Subhash Gatade. I am associated with New Socialist Initiative. Our guest this evening is Professor Jayati Ghosh, an internationally recognized development economist. She has taught for 35 years at Jawaharlal Nehru University. And since 2021, she is teaching at University of Amherst, Massachusetts, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Her core areas of study include international economics, globalization, macroeconomic policy, gender, and development. In addition to teaching, she has authored and edited 21 books and contributed more than 200 articles to various journals. This is a list of few of her books. The recent books: The Making of a Catastrophe, COVID-19 and the Indian Economy, When Governments Fail, COVID-19 and the Economy, Women Workers in the Informal Economy, which was brought out by Routledge, Demonetization Decoded, that was also brought out by Routledge, Elgar Handbook of Alternate Theories of Economic Development, and 2012, Jayati was part of a group which brought out this Earth for All, which was brought out after 50 years of the Club of Rome's report, Limits to Growth. So, and she has received recipient of many awards, many national and international awards, and the latest one being John Kenneth Galbraith Award, which was given by Agricultural and Applied Economic Association. She has advised government and in India and other countries. She has consulted for international organizations, including ILO, UNDP, UNCTAD. In the year 2021, she was appointed the World Health Organization Council on the Economics for Health for All. In 2022, she was appointed to the United Nations Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, which was mandated to provide vision for international cooperation about current and future challenges. She writes regularly for popular magazines and journals. And this evening she will be talking about democracy and the logic of capitalism, the recent Indian experience. Friends, please welcome Professor Jayati Ghosh.
Thank you so much, Subhashi. I'm really delighted to be part of this and to see so many friends and people I respect as part of the audience. So it's really a great pleasure for me to be talking to all of you. I'm planning to actually just give you some of my more general thoughts on this. I can't claim to have researched this very extensively. These are certainly issues that I've been thinking about, like all of you have, for a while. But I have a particular thesis which I think we can establish perhaps with some degree of certainty, but it is still a thesis being formulated. And it's essentially this. Let me tell you my punchline, if you like, the basic argument to begin with. I believe that capitalism is antithetical to democracy. I believe that the logic of capitalism is one that is fundamentally undemocratic, and that therefore democracies only survive and persist if they are able to control capital. So that's really my basic argument. I'm saying that unless a democracy is able to control the logic of capital, it will not remain a democracy. And it will have the trappings of a democracy, perhaps, in terms of certain formal structures, but it will not have some of the essence of democracy. And of course, we can have a discussion about what would constitute that essence. But let me leave it there for now, and I'll come back to that. So I think to get into that, we first have to understand, okay, so what is it about capitalism? What am I saying is the logic of capitalism? I think everyone knows that, if you had to identify the essence of what is capitalism, I think most people would say it is profit orientation, private competition, it is commercialization of activities, the commodification of activities, and the fact that Some possess only their labor power, whereas others possess the means whereby they can employ the labor power. So these are, broadly speaking, the logic that people mostly talk about. But of course, underlying all of this is private property. And clearly, capitalism would not exist without private property. Private property is different from personal property, which is something that has existed through time. The idea that, you know, there are certain things that are personal to individuals, households, communities, etc. But private property is the idea not only of ownership, but of alienability, that you can sell it, that you can transfer it as you please, and that you can acquire it, therefore. And this is fundamental to capitalism. In fact, the legal scholar Katerina Pistor has argued that really it is legal codes that define capitalism, that we're making a mistake by saying that, you know, it's these relations of production, etc. Those relations of production would not exist without the legal codes that underlie them. And there is a history to that evolution of the legal codes that creates capitalism, and particularly that creates private property. Now, once you recognize this, then you realize that the role of the state is crucial. Capitalism cannot exist without the state. At no point is it ever not reliant on the state, because it is the state that is enforcing this private property and the different forms that it takes and the new kinds of property that are created. I'm going to talk about that. We keep getting new forms of private property. Earlier, it would have been land, would have been, let's say, gold, jewelry, etc., financial assets. We now have the idea of intellectual property as a private property that can be acquired, alienated, and so on and so forth. So we now have a very significant system in which it is supposedly markets that are running the show, but it is always and essentially the state that is determining the conditions under which these markets operate, the ability of these markets to operate at all, and in fact, in the entire framing of capitalism. So I think first we have to remember this, because very often, especially in the neoliberal world that we're in, we are told that, oh, you know, the state is withdrawing and the markets are going to take over and so on. There is never a possibility of the state withdrawing. The state has to be as fundamental to any functioning of capitalism. And that means, of course, that the nature of the state matters greatly. And so there's a contradiction at the heart of this. Because capitalism itself, the logic of capital, once again, is one that has an inherent tendency to concentration. This is something that has been talked about not even since Marx, before Marx, the ability of capitals, of individual enterprises or employers to actually gain at the expense of others, to grow in market share and to exert market power, is something that is also very much a fundamental feature of capitalism. And it's something that we have seen over time. We've seen it evolve. We've seen extreme concentration and we have seen extreme centralization, you know, where which works in both ways, that you have multinational enterprises today in the world that dominate not just vertically in that sector, but they dominate across sectors. In India, we are used to business houses that are conglomerates that are dealing in a whole range of activities, but are also vertically integrated and controlling all the different aspects of that, which means that they are not only controlling market power as sellers, but they are also controlling and have a great deal of market power as buyers. And so concentration is an inherent aspect of capitalism. But of course, concentration is contradictory with competition, right? I mean, competition is supposed to be where everybody, and of course, the textbook way that is still that economics presents markets is the competitive market, that everybody's competing on more or less equal terms, and therefore you're getting these prices and so on. The way capitalism operates is therefore in terms of managing these contradictions, and it manages them through the state, okay? It turns out that because of this inherent tendency to concentration, there is an inherent tendency also to greater inequality. And that's not just the inequality between capitals, which of course is, it follows from concentration that there is an inequality between capitals. But it is also the inequality between large capital and pretty much everyone else. And yes, obviously between capital and the working class, but it is, we know, a more complicated world. There are peasantry, there are self-employed producers, tiny micro enterprises. There is unpaid labor on which capitalism relies heavily, let's not forget, especially in a country like India. So all of these different groups, classes, whatever you want to call it, they are, in a sense, they lose in terms of asset control, income shares, etc., relative to large capital in the process of concentration. That loss in turn means that the market for capital gets reduced. And so that's another contradiction that, in the typical terminology, it's called underconsumption, that the ability of the rest of society to consume enough to constitute a large market for capital is something that is affected by concentration and inequality. And yet concentration and inequality are the logic of capitalism. So once again, the state has to play a role. The state plays a role either through directly intervening and creating demand. Military expenditure is a big one, for example, or various other kinds of things, or by creating different forms of mitigation of that inequality, fiscal policy where you tax some people and you provide public services, you provide transfers of income to create that kind of demand, or by enabling finance. And what is the thing about finance? Finance enables people to consume even if they're not getting the income. It allows debt. So earlier, the notion that finance has an important role in capitalism was really confined to producers, that producers need working capital and investment capital, and finance provides that. So households save, and the employers, the producers, they invest. We now have finance that is also heavily devoted to consumption. And that's part of this inherent contradiction within the way capitalism has evolved, that because you're not enabling the incomes to increase of the larger group of the population, you somehow need to generate the ability to consume. And that is done through finance. So you have the emergence of many new forms of debt. It's not just the old style of consumer debt, or what is called credit card today in the credit card debt in the modern world. It is student debt. It's the purchase of houses. It's the purchase of any large consumer durable, and so on and so forth. All kinds of consumption, and of course, still in large parts of our country, debt simply for survival, debt for food, debt for basic consumption. All of these are basically mediated through finance, and that becomes an additional source of demand. Again, something that has to be mediated by the state. Because remember, all of this is really about contracts, it's about the future, it's uncertain. Who's going to make it certain for you? It has to be a state and a legal system that is underwriting all of this, okay? Now, this was, in fact, the way capitalism functioned, but as I made an earlier point, that capitalism really or rather it is compatible with democracy only when a lot of this is controlled. So let's think of the periods earlier to the neoliberal period, when in fact it's often now seen as one of the golden ages of global capitalism, right? That the period, especially after the Second World War, when there were many, certainly there was an expansion of the welfare state in the rich countries, in the US, Europe, etc. But there was a significant decolonization and an attempt at national economic development among a whole range of newly independent states. This is a period when, in fact, capital was controlled. It doesn't mean that capitalism was done away with. No, these are very much capitalist societies and economies, but it was controlled. There were limits put on capital in a whole range of ways. And of course, these limits varied from country to country. In India, we had what we call Nehruvian planning. We had very strict limits on what private investors could do, where they could invest, how much they could invest, and so on. We had import controls, we had trade restrictions, we had control over finance, we had a range of very specific controls. But even in the shall we say, the beating heart of capitalism, the core of the global capitalist economy, there were very significant controls. And they were broadly, I would say, in three major areas. The first is the regulatory aspect, which is something I've already talked about in India, but there were many controls on the ways in which capital could operate. And of course, the regulatory controls extend beyond just directing investment, but all kinds of things: protecting the environment, protecting communities, dealing with the labor market, which labor regulations and how much minimum wages, or different kinds of conditions for the protection of workers, safety regulations, etc., etc., etc. There were many, many different kinds of regulatory controls over capital. But in addition, there was if you like, the power placed, the limits on the power of capital placed by the ability of workers to associate. The significance of trade unions and workers' associations really should not be underestimated. We've almost forgotten how important they were, but they were very significant as a countervailing force. John Kenneth Galbraith actually called it specifically one of the countervailing forces of capitalism. It was an ability to push back against excessive power, to ask for greater wage shares, and so on and so forth. So all of these, similarly, were essential parts of that control over capital that I have mentioned. And then, of course, there was the ability of capital to control, the media, the ability of the state and society to provide alternative voices, to recognize the civil society, if you like, elements, and the spreading of information that could count as a kind of counterbalance to capital. So these are all features that were fairly widespread, including in the what we would consider the extreme capitalist economies. And, when you think of, let's say, a country, well, a city-state like Singapore, everyone sees this as this absolutely extreme market-oriented economy. In fact, it's highly regulated. And Singapore remains highly regulated even today in every possible way. So in a way, the periods when democracy was able to persist, survive, etc., were periods, in fact, when it was able to control capital in specific ways. And why is that important? Because now what we find is that the period of deregulation that we have seen broadly from the 1980s onwards globally, in India from the 1990s onwards, the period that at one point we used to all use as the short form LPG, right? Liberalization, privatization, globalization. That period was one in which progressively these constraints on capital have been removed. And this in turn creates a problem, certainly for democracy, but it also creates a problem for capital. So let me begin with the problem it creates for capital. And then I will turn to the problem that it creates for democracy. The problem that it creates for capital is essentially that the point I mentioned earlier, that as you get more and more unequal, as you allow one section of the economy to grab more and more of the spoils of any economic expansion or income growth, to control more and more of the assets and so on, you reduce the capacity of the others to generate a market for that capital. And whichever way you look at it, capital requires a market. So within a country, they can look outside, you can look for export-led growth, you can invest abroad, you can do all of that kind of thing. But eventually, capital will need a market. You can use the state to create new forms of market through defense spending, through other kinds of spending. You can use the state to generate welfare measures that create a bit of a market. You can do all of those, but you need the market. And as you continue with a more and more unequal pattern, that market shrinks. We are seeing the evidence of that so clearly in India, right? I mean, many economists have been pointing this out for a while, that at least for the last 10 years, the domestic consumer market is not growing. But suddenly large capital has woken up to this as well, right? We're getting noises from the big market survey companies, from the big corporations, from all the companies selling what they call fast-moving consumer goods, etc., that our market is shrinking, our market is stagnating or shrinking. We are not able to sell, and that's a critical feature of that contradiction. Essentially, what has happened globally, and this is, by the way, what we're seeing in India is an extreme reflection because we also have the extreme inequality, but we're seeing this globally. We have seen large capital has become too successful for its own good. It has effectively eliminated all the barriers to its activities, whether they are regulatory barriers or the barriers posed by, let's say, trade unions and the associations of workers, or the barriers posed by civil society. It's got rid of these. And in that process, it is now in that classic prey-predator relationship where the predator eats too much of the prey. There is it's called the Lotka-Volterra equations in biology. Basically, the predator has to keep a certain amount of prey alive to survive itself. Otherwise, it goes hungry. And so we're getting into that phase of capitalism, which is why globally you find capitalism is actually quite moribund. It may surprise you because, what we will hear is about the huge money that Elon Musk is making or the massive expansions of Google and so on. But globally, investment rates across the world are lower than they have been over decades. And this has been true for the past decade. Globally, capital is really, it's a patient on a table being kept alive by blood transfusions from especially the central banks of rich countries, which have been putting huge amounts of money in, or fiscal policies of states, the large states, okay? So it is moribund because of that logic and that nature. And what happened in this process is that the ability of capital to rely on an ever-expanding market, which in the earlier days, in the early decades of globalization, was created simply by that fact of globalization, by the entry of major new economies into that global market, specifically China, and to a lesser extent, India, and so on. That made up for the wage stagnation and the increasing inequality, etc., in the rich world. That's no longer the case. Now you kind of exhausted that possibility. And until you can once again exert control on capital, you're going to face this fundamental economic dilemma. Now, how does that translate into politics? Now, here I'm treading on much thinner ice, and I know that there are people here who are listening who will have a much better sense of how this plays out in the political world. But let me put to you a number of propositions. First of all, that this necessity for, or this inherent tendency for greater inequality has got to be associated with a reduction of human rights. Certainly, social and economic rights are affected, but in the process, civil and political rights are also affected. They are affected because people will protest, people will require different changes, people will demand that they would at least enable their previous standards of living or have less fragility and so on and so forth. All of those will happen. So there's a need to somehow keep those under check. But also because the dissatisfactions that are generated by this, and particularly the insecurities and the fragilities of the new life. So what is so interesting. I'm in the United States, and we've just had, as you know, this very significant election in which people who we would see in India as having a pretty good standard of living are extremely dissatisfied with their material circumstances. And that is not necessarily because they are getting significantly less than they got before. In fact, real wages are stagnant. They haven't fallen, okay, for the vast majority of the workers. But it is because of insecurity. This insecurity of livelihoods, of the possibilities of future employment, of the fear that any small shock can completely eliminate your savings, force you into debt, cause huge turmoil and upheaval in your lives, the lack of safety nets, which are all part of that broader point that I had made earlier about deregulation. All of those are the things that are creating anger. And just as we have seen in India, that anger is then directed not at a large global process or a market or even a state that you cannot do anything about, but it is directed to others. And we know who the others are always defined as. In the US, they are migrants. In India, we have chosen Muslims and migrants. And of course, the combination of Muslim migrants. In different countries, you choose different others to vilify and to blame. And that is then further pushed by the emergence of those who present themselves as strong men who can solve the problem. And what is so interesting about the commonality across the strong men that we are seeing in so many parts of the world, certainly in India, you think of Erdogan in Turkey, you think of Sisi in Egypt, you think of different parts of the world where so-called strong men emerge. And the thing is always similar. It is a broad and very general promise of fixing things without specifics. I mean, none of them really has a specific. It's always the opposition that is asked for very specific programs and proposals. Broad brush, I will fix it. Broad brush, I can do what I like. And a calling out of the hypocrisy of the earlier lot. And I think the third part is something we don't adequately appreciate. And I think this is something that is as true in India as it has been in the recent election in India. There is certainly a search for some, really very self-confident and doesn't matter about all the other personal qualities. Person who says, I'm going to go out there and shake it all up and change it and fix it for you. But it is also a disgust at the apparent hypocrisy of those who claim to be doing something for people who are, in fact, still operating very much within that logic of deregulated capital. And I think that is one of the ways in which the democratic process, the electoral democracy process, has played out in many of our countries. Now, the thing about this is, of course, democracy goes well beyond electoral democracy. And what we know in India, and which I have been telling my friends here in the US to be very wary of, is that electoral democracy may seem superficial, and in many ways it is, but it's also important because controlling the levers of the state enables you to undermine many other aspects of democracy. It enables us, we know only too well, to use the investigative agencies, the legal agencies, the policing agencies, etc. And all the instruments of the state can be used to promote a particular group and to suppress dissent, opposition, etc. So civil and political rights are immediately affected. Some of that suppression of civil and political rights is supposedly popular because it is directed against the other, against the enemy, against the minorities or the migrants or whoever. And that is actually seen as something that many people will want. However unpleasant it may be, it's unfortunately true that many people actually want that. But the undermining of the other essential rights, and essentially the undermining of any rights-based discourse at all, is a very major feature of the new elected autocracies. We know that in India. I don't have to tell this audience about how the essential social and economic rights have been so sharply undermined. And in fact, even the idea that you would have rights-based legislations that make it a responsibility of the state, an obligation of the state, rather than a gift from the state or from a particular leader to the people, that is really sought to be undermined. But a similar thing is underway here. And it's so fascinating that I find now in both countries, the issue of citizenship is coming up in a very big way. We saw it in India with the CAA and the way in which the CAA has been used, was brought in essentially to make citizenship a gift from the state rather than a right. And we are seeing exactly the same thing here. It is identified in terms of migrants at the moment, but essentially it's part of a broader way in which citizenship is going to become a gift of the US government to those whom it deems to be worthy of it. And of course, insofar as anybody has rights, it's only citizens. And so you limit those who have rights. Now, this is combined. I want to go back to the economics of it, the concentration. We are seeing the world's most, the greatest concentration ever of the global economy. And we are possibly seeing a really huge, great concentration of the global polity as well, in a way that, despite all of these, new emerging powers and China and et cetera, we are seeing power concentrated in very few individuals, very, very few individuals who are able to influence decision-making beyond what any of us could imagine. We have, for example, Elon Musk, who is not just the richest man in the world, but also controls one of the major sources of information that people have through what is supposedly a public platform for exchange of information and views, that is Twitter or X, who is also today hugely important in economic policy decision-making and will be a major element of all Trump economic policy in the next 4 years, who is therefore able to influence not just US domestic policy, but global policy, global economic policy, including to all kinds of multilateralism, international economic relations, et cetera, and also in terms of the control of information that goes to many of these through that platform. So we're seeing kinds of concentration that we have not seen before, actually strikingly similar to Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. We are seeing that kind of concentration. Now, that, of course, undermines democracy. I don't have to tell you that. But that, too, is part of that other economic contradiction within capitalism. All that excess power creates a problem. It creates inequalities that actually generate a stagnationist impulse, not an expansionary impulse. And remember, whether we think economic growth is a good thing or not, capitalism does. Capitalism is all about growth. It is the logic of the cancer cell. It only exists when it grows. Its justification is expansion, economic, material expansion, income expansion. That's its only raison d'etre. And anything, the degree of concentration that we're now seeing is one that will give you immediate spurts of boom right now, let's say in the US or in some other countries. But over time, it is a stagnationist impulse. It is not an expansionary impulse. So it is something that undermines itself from within. Now, what does that mean then, if for those of us who want democracy in our own country and in the world? Does it mean that we are basically headed for doom, that we're going to get this stagnationist decline in which capitalism will be? I think the German philosopher Wolfgang Strick put it rather well. He said capitalism is already dead. It's just that and there's no one there to move the dead body out of the way. So it is sort of hanging all over us as this dead body, stifling all of us economically, socially, politically, and so on. It doesn't have to happen that way. It doesn't actually, these are not inevitabilities. These are products of domestic, social, political churning, mobilization, etc. They are definitely made more difficult by control over media and by all the other deregulation that I talked about. But remember, these are all things created by humans, and they can be therefore overturned by humans and changed by humans. So I see today in the global economy and in India, I see once again possibilities for churning that had kind of really come down, even especially in that period, the hypocritical period when everybody pretended that it was all liberal democracies that are in favor of markets and so on. We are now in a period of churning where it is much more possible for progressive forces to actually insert themselves in ways and cause progressive change. And if we have to think about whether it is possible at all, we have to only look a little bit down south to our neighbor Sri Lanka, where we have had a very dramatic election 2 days ago, which following the upheaval of the presidential election a couple of months ago, we have now had the parliamentary elections, which I hope, have the potential to transform the economic trajectory of that country and therefore the democratic trajectory of that country. And I think that possibility should give all of us hope. But let me stop here because I'm much more anxious to hear the discussion and all of your comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Jayati Ghosh, for this interesting and exhaustive presentation. Before we start the discussion, and I ask the present friends to share their views and comments, but let me ask Ravi, my friend, to share a few his and his take on this presentation. Ravi, please.
Thank you, Subhash, and uh, thank you so much, Professor Ghosh, Jayati, I'm sorry. Thank you for accepting our invitation and for such comprehensive, lucid talk with such solid framework. As Subhash and Bhargav prepare their list to invite comments from many luminaries and all our friends who are in the audience, I just get this opportunity to give them time to I kick off the question and answer session by asking the first question that has become the ritual in this meeting. So yeah, it was great. It was such clear analysis and clear presentation that you made. The question I have in mind may be kind of supplementary question because, it is, I understand yours is a very comprehensive, holistic framework. But my curiosity is about the possibilities of resistance to capitalism, no matter, in theory or in principle or in reality. It may be moribund. It may be showing many internal contradictions, but still resistance from people, especially from working people, is needed. So I would like to know your comments about why globally and especially in India, the resistance of working people have gone down. And one example that I have in mind, that may be the supplementary question, is that why it is that for majority of people, some identity becomes the internal other on which the ruling people are able to focus the attention as the internal enemy or internal other, maybe immigrants in America or Muslims in India. So why does that happen? Also, it seems to me that working people, one would expect that will be repelled by Elon Musk, dancing on whose Trump's election platform or whatever, or having such power. People seem to have not so much of a problem with the ultra rich, but they often have problem with what is known as intellectual elite. In US, for example, the coastal elite. In India, JNU was targeted, for example, as adda of anti-nationals. So how come working people have such strong views against intellectual elite, and they don't have any problem with the ultra rich? Ambani's had a probably most expensive marriage in human history, here in India. So the display of wealth, display of power, display of control, the working people have no problem with that, and they are often alienated by what they see as the intellectual elite, the JNU walas or the urban Naxals or whatever. So your comments, before we invite other luminaries and others from the audience, your comments, if you could.
Should I respond?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. These are such good questions. Okay, I'm going to take going to take them in the opposite order. I think this issue, this thing about why people get so angry with these in the US they call liberal elites, and certainly in India we were the targets as JNU and so on. I think there is, the way, especially now, a lot of popular media present the super rich, it's entirely aspirational. It's all very much, wow, look at this. This is how they live. You could have this lifestyle, if you are lucky, and so on and so forth. And it's also that there's little, if you like, condescension in that. It's just people glorying in their riches, right? The Ambani wedding, a lot of people I know described it as vulgar beyond belief. But it's that vulgarity which is accessible, if you see what I mean. That, it's a kind of maximal version of someone spending, all selling huge amounts of land for their daughter's wedding in a village somewhere. And certainly here in the US, there is a lot of anger towards the liberal elites ever since the 1990s, and when the Clintons basically made that their motivational thing, because increasingly that's become the hard thing to get into. There is still the occasional, I won't say rags to riches, because they're all pretty rich people who got access to something, but there is the presentation of the extremely wealthy as ordinary guys. I mean, look at Donald Trump, right? He wears a baseball cap. He looks pretty yucky. He behaves in this very slobbish manner. It's kind of approachable. It's kind of, you don't feel that he's looking down on you. Whereas a highly educated person, coming from a university background like Kamala Harris, first of all, confronts identity issues with opposite identity issues. So, here is one group of a segment of society that is othering migrants and blacks and minorities and so on. And another group of a society is saying, oh, we celebrate difference and we're all about cultural rainbow, but it's only about identity. There's really no economic program in there that says, I'm really out there to change your conditions of life. And in fact, the Democratic Party has been very clear it's not going to allow an alternative economic program. It demolished Bernie Sanders when he had an economic program. It demolished Elizabeth Warren, who had an economic program. So it's definitely not about an alternative economic program. It's more about creating a more respectable, shall we say, intellectually respectable economic program. And with that comes a significant amount of what is seen as condescension. So Hillary Clinton did herself in when she described people who supported Donald Trump as deplorable. But, it was in everything else in the body language of the Democratic Party today, the mainstream Democratic Party, is a separation from ordinary working people. Number one. Number two is the massive role of the media. And I come back to that. I think both in India and in the US, mainstream media plays such an important role. And we don't understand the extent to which it's not necessarily the news media. We're possibly looking at the wrong thing. We should be looking at the entertainment media. Apparently, I mean, the US is full of these reality shows, which are all about the mega rich. There are something called Real Housewives. There's some real estate porn type things. There are all these reality shows which are consumed massively by ordinary people, which are all aspirational and which all will have the, the individual, apparently, character in them who comes from a relatively poor background, but who's making billions by selling real estate or by marrying rich or by doing whatever it is that they do. And these are seen as the way to go. And this has a very large impact. I think something similar is happening possibly even with popular media in India. I've not been tracking it enough, but people tell me that not necessarily just the news. I mean, we know how bad the news is in India, but the non-news part is also equally scary and damaging, I think, in terms of the whole problem you mentioned of, the ultra-rich and the intellectual elites and the anger against those. Why does identity become the ruling other? Because that's what they want. That's the easiest way of getting at people. It's not class. It's not economics. It's not equality of opportunities or access or anything. It's all about the color of your skin or in India, your caste or your religion or whatever. These are not the things that would force you to address the fundamentals of the economic reality. That's what they want, and that's what they're able to push and promote, and what people appear to fall for, at least for a time. And I think this relates to the resistance of working people. I won't say it's the resistance has gone down. I think what has happened is that they have got cynical about whether the supposedly alternative political parties are really going to give them something very different. And I think that cynicism is really, it's not that they are less angry, but it's just that the anger is taking other forms. And again, when you look at individual pockets of risk, whether it is more and more workers in Amazon in the US trying to organize, or it is people in different parts of India resisting specific economic atrocities against themselves. Or, and I go back to the Aragalaya in Sri Lanka, and now the democratic vote in Sri Lanka. People are resisting. It's not that they're not. It's just that it's been easy to manipulate in certain directions. I don't think that can continue indefinitely.
Professor Harbas Mukhia.
Okay. Yes.
Please share your question. Yeah, it'd be good. You shared your question query in the chat box. Can you please tell us about it?
Jayati, you just mentioned casually the equation, established and accepted equation, almost universally accepted equation of democracy with elections. I think you have talked extensively about capitalism, but I wanted to hear you on democracy as well. How do you understand democracy? I think that equation of democracy with elections itself is a problem which we need to address. I mean, obviously, elections are so structured. I mean, now I'm beginning to think that the very notion of election is so structured as to ensure minority rule rather than majority rule everywhere. Whether it's Trump has got a majority this time, but usually most governments are elected by minorities, and also that most governments are not only elected by minorities ruling over majorities, but also with a certain kind of restraint or constraints imposed on them through the very election process. You see, so I was wondering I wanted to hear you on democracy as much as or as well on capitalism. How do you understand democracy beyond election?
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, this is one of the things I was intending to elaborate on later, and I forgot. So thank you for reminding me. Absolutely. I mean, I think, yes, electoral democracy. What I was trying to do then is I talk about how, liberal democracies as they present themselves are presented in electoral terms. They say, we are a liberal democracy, we have Western values, so-called, or, all of these so-called universal values, which are all about the electoral process. And we know that electoral process is hugely compromised, of course, in pretty much every country. In the US, exceptionally so, because apparently there's a 99% correlation between the amount of money a candidate raises and their victory. And this is not something that happened today. It is something that's been happening for 30 years. There's a direct correlation. And of course, their election laws make the funding of, it's indefinite, the amount you can fund, pretty much like our electoral bonds, except that at least you know who's giving the money. But otherwise, it is, it's extremely money power based. So definitely there is much more to democracy. And of course, I would put it, if I had to think of a very simple definition, because, there's economic democracy, there's in terms of equitable access and opportunities, there is social democracy in terms of voice. But if I had to put one word, perhaps, that to me would be the essence of democracy, it would be accountability. And I think that's what has been lost over time. The idea of elections was precisely to provide accountability, that, they don't deliver what they promise, you throw them out, etc. In that ideal world, that could have happened. And in some cases, it still does. But increasingly we find, and once again, I go back to the legal codes, that there are legal codes nationally and internationally that prevent even the most well-intentioned elected governments from being able to do what they can do. And that's a broader issue of how capitalism is played out in terms of the legal codes. But again, I want to re-emphasize, these are also legal codes that have not just been created over time, but have been constantly reinvented. I mean, 20 years ago, who had even thought intellectual property rights is a big deal? So in other words, we are constantly reinventing these legal codes, which means we can constantly seek to alter them in progressive ways. And on the issue of elections, I would say that they are certainly not necessarily a sufficient condition for democracy in any of the ways in which I think you and I would agree on, but they are a necessary condition. And again, you're not going to get sufficient change in the nature of the state without something to change it. So we can choose between, an electoral upheaval or a coup, but you have to change the nature of the state. It doesn't just happen on its own. They don't suddenly see the light and become Mother Teresa, so we have to think of ways in which that state can be changed, because the legal codes, as I've mentioned, they depend on that state. So, yeah.
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 There is a question following mine. I think.
Yeah.
I think Balveer has raised his hand. I would
Yeah,
love
yes,
to hear.
yes, yeah.
Ask Professor Arora first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that?
Now, is it okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jayati, thank you very much. That was a real treat, because you not only looked at India, but you gave us a very lucid analysis of the American scene, and thanks for pointing out the ray of hope in Sri Lanka. So I think altogether we have a holistic perspective which stimulates us to think of many things. On one particular aspect I'd like to begin is the question of the regulatory state and the regulatory instruments and the regulatory mechanisms. It is becoming increasingly clear that there is a capture. And a capture in what direction? It's not just a capture in the direction of making it easier for capitalism, but it's a capture in the direction of crony capitalism. That is one of the features, and you rightly said that accountability is the core of the whole exercise. Public accountability and the instruments of accountability, the mechanisms of accountability have also been weakened. I don't need to enumerate them, but even the parliamentary committees, but there is a whole range of instruments which were designed to regulate, to ensure that the democratic mandate was respected in some superficial way. The second point that I'd like to place before you, Jayati, is that in America, as in India, there are different ways for counterpowers to operate. I'm going beyond the checks and balances that operate in Washington or in Delhi. I am looking at the ways in which different parts of the country resist undue, how should I put it, pressure or influence on their lives, and go counter to the democratic mandate that exists where they are living. Talking about a federal state, talking about the fact that California can resist, that Kerala can resist, but also the fact that the counter of what is loosely called cooperative federalism is what Heather Gerken of the Yale Law School calls uncooperative federalism. Now, that is a direction in which, when all the other checks that you mentioned have been weakened, the trade unions, and I think you may give us a very clear picture of how all that had been eroded. Is there a possibility to explore other countervailing forces, but then within the political system, within the electoral democracy that we are talking about? Because as you said, it's not going to go away anytime soon. How does one work one's way around the collapse of the earlier effective counterpowers? And that's the direction I wanted to take you.
This is a really profound point, Balvidya, and I completely agree. I should have actually also mentioned, it's so interesting what you said, because, you know, this is exactly what they're talking about here. In Massachusetts, suddenly they're discovering the joys of federalism. It's funny because it was earlier the Republicans who kept saying this, the states are the ones who should have the power and so on. And now everyone here is saying, no, we are the ones who are going to have control over the police, the education, the health system, et cetera, et cetera. So yes, federalism is one way of combating a much broader force of, the other kind. And I completely take your point that it is one important counterpower. I think, however, that, unfortunately, the central government in India and the federal government, they retain enormous power. Right? And we've seen this operate with the states. We've seen how states get denied relief funds when they have major disasters. They get denied their rightful share of GST. They get denied the ability to borrow, etc. It's endless. The kinds of restrictions that are being put on opposition-ruled states in India could fill at least 10 pages in terms of with bullet points, right? So in other words, every effort is made to undermine. And I would say that while I see the benefit of this, it's really hard if the judiciary is also stacked against you. Yeah, and that we know that in India, and they're going to discover that in the US. They're going to discover all of this, all the stuff that we are only too familiar with. They're going to discover what happens when you lose all three organs of the state. And because yes, states can do something, but ultimately there's a broader framework in which they operate. And it's really difficult to swim against that tide. And it's not necessarily only now in these periods of extreme centralization, like Modi and Trump and so on, in which it's very evident, as you said, and also with the cronies and with everything. That, of course, I saw this when I was advising the government of West Bengal in the 2000s under a UPA government, when the limits on anything progressive was so strong because of the broad neoliberal thrust of the government, where even the centrally sponsored schemes came with conditions that forced you to, in a way, be neoliberal yourself. And in fact, made that government turn neoliberal to its own huge loss. But the point is, there are really lots of constraints that central governments can put, which to me, it's a miracle that opposition governments have managed to remain and do what they do, because they really have a very tough call. However, I think, again, to bring some hope into it, the very fact that those governments persist means that there is that potential for the broader change as well, and for pushing of those boundaries, and maybe for even restructuring that federalism, which still remains very centralized. I mean, it is supposedly cooperative and whatever, but it's actually deeply centralized. So I think that also, perhaps the pushes will come to change that and to therefore create many more of the checks and balances that you're talking about. Yeah.
Professor Shekhar Ramakrishnan had raised a supplementary question to what Ms. Harvansh Mukhia was saying. Shekhar, please, will you please share your question?
Yeah, I'll just maybe rephrase it. I was really thrilled as I was composing my long message. I saw Professor Mukhia's comment, and I thought, really, I have so much respect for his work. Yeah, very briefly, I feel there is a basic dilemma here. That's how I feel personally, that democracy means the population decides. And the electoral democracy is certainly a reasonable way to judge what people think. But it seems, based on what has been happening in India for many years, and this time, this month in the US, somebody talked about Trump dancing on stage and so on. I mean, he is obviously senile. He's lost his faculties, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. White people vote for him. White women who supposedly were so upset at the abortion rights decision, they voted for him, majority. So it's not at all clear to me that the population votes based on, and the Biden IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, did a lot for working people in this country, but especially white people. But it doesn't matter to the white population in this country. They look at a white guy doddering, and they look at a woman of color running against him. And that's it. So they vote for him. So it's not clear to me, how the popular class interests and so on come in at all. If white women can vote for Trump, if the white working class can vote for Trump, then it's not clear to me at all, where we are going with democracy, electoral democracy. So that's my, obviously, I'm very depressed. So.
Yeah, I think there's no getting away from the fact that both misogyny and racism played a role in this election. There's no question, definitely. A lot of Black men also voted for Trump because they didn't want a woman. And lots of white people voted for Trump because they didn't want a colored person. All that is definitely there. I'm not disputing that at all. But I think, there are two things. One is that there was a fundamental hypocrisy in the way in which the campaign was run, for sure. Of these, where you are basically embracing, Dick Cheney, the real hawks of the earlier period of the Bush administration. You're trying to go for the centrist Republicans who have a deeply neoliberal agenda. You abandoning every bit of the progressive agenda that you had in the first 2 weeks of that, when she was first anointed. And otherwise, you don't seem to have any economic policy. So the fact that she had a very much a continuation of the same was an important thing. You are absolutely right that the Biden
I'm sorry, I disagree, Todd, strongly.
Okay.
I don't think pushing the progressive agenda would have won any more of the white women's votes or the white working class votes. They voted based on
this is the thing.
racism.
This is the thing about racism or sexism or communalism in India, which is that, yes, it's a very powerful motivating force, and we can't kid ourselves about it. I completely agree with you there. But it's also never the only force, and it's never that people will ever change. I think communalism can be created, and we've seen how it has been created in India, and communal identities can be created and nurtured and pushed. And less communal identities can similarly also be changed. Muzaffarnagar in India is a good example of this. Muzaffarnagar, where the riots were, where it was hugely anti-Muslim sentiment that dominated the 2019 elections, and where we saw very different things because of a lot of very quiet work of people on the ground, activists on the ground, who were actually undermining that particular approach. So I concede that, yes, there is racism, there is sexism, there is all of that. There's no doubt about it, and it played a big role. But I don't think these are inevitable and will continue forever and ever in the future. But to combat them, you do need a broader agenda in which you identify the common interests of white and colored and other workers and those who are affected by these. So I think there is good reason to be depressed, but I don't think that would be the only explicand of what has happened.
I will request Bhargav to please share a few questions.
Good evening, Professor Jayati. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. And now I'm going to take some of the questions from the chat box. And
let me also look.
One question from Parivartan. Thank you for your talk, Professor Jayati Ghosh. My question is, historically speaking, capitalism has been linked with liberalism, but now, as your talk also highlights, capitalism is taking an anti-liberal turn. But how will this anti-liberal turn help capitalism? That is, will anti-modern thought or fascism help capitalism flourish? If yes, how?
You know, I think it all comes back to what it does for the economy, because capitalism is really, finally, it's all about the cash, right? It's all about making the profits and expanding and growing and so on. And if you get to what I have been describing, I mean, as I said, it is literally a global capitalism is a patient on life support, getting blood transfusions from states, and particularly core economic states, through monetary policy, fiscal policy, imperialist policy, and all of that. The degree to which you can continue doing that is open to question. And I think, especially with the advance of new technologies, which are going to be, if they actually play out as they're supposed to, horrendously labor displacing, and which are going to be able to cause manipulations of people in ways that we can't even begin to imagine yet. We don't know how this will play out. So remember, the purpose of capitalism is to keep making more and more and more profits. It's accumulation, right? That's the whole thing. That's the reason it's there for. And when the system is not able to deliver that, a lot of those internal contradictions then start becoming expressed in other ways. And then you get, in fact, demands for a reaffirmation of welfare states, or you get a reaffirmation of these other kinds of voices being heard, and so on. These are phases. We've been through really terrible phases before. I think it's important to have a long historical view of this. This is not the first time we're experiencing extreme oligarchies and control, although it's true that now it's combined with new things like new technology and possibilities of thought control through media and so on. But still, we've been through these phases before. And I'm not describing necessarily a pendulum swing of history, but I'm saying that it reaches limits. It reaches limits, and those limits then mean that the system itself and the rulers of the system itself decide that it has to be changed. It has to be reformed in some way. So I suspect that that is likely to happen. Whether it necessarily means that you will get, shall we say, you won't get back to a different... okay, let me put it this way. Mukul Keshavan has a very interesting article in the Telegraph, I think it was today or yesterday, where he's describing the Jekyll and Hyde aspects of US capitalism and US democracy. Biden being Jekyll and Trump being Hyde. But basically that it's not so much that this is a polarized society and polity. It is a bipolar society and polity. It expresses itself in these different ways every now and then, but the fundamental being is the same, and that fundamental being is based on a reliance on US empire and US imperialism in ways that are expressed differently over time. Now, does that mean that for the rest of us in the rest of the world, we have to say, well, that's just the way it is and that's how we cope? No, because what we're seeing increasingly is that we're getting, if you like, a prequel. I think the Indian experience is exactly what the US is going to go through. We have already experienced a lot of that, and we know where it goes. And we also know that pockets of resistance form in different ways. I mean, well, we talked about the federal thing, that I still believe if there had been free and fair elections in India in May and June this year, it would have been a different result. But we do get different kinds of protest, resistance, and response. And we are also seeing that globally. We are seeing very unsavory and disgusting regimes come together in ways that are going to move away from the US stream of doing things. And when that happens, the US itself is going to be forced to change, both globally and nationally. So these are all, how shall I say, this is a very dynamic, I would say even it's a fluid situation. We know that Trump is a great disruptor. He's going to disrupt a lot. With disruptions, you don't know what comes out. It's like Samudra Manthan. Good stuff comes out, bad stuff comes out. So I would say that we have to really be prepared for different kinds of unpredictability and shocks in ways that we can't be very sure about the implications.
There is a question from Yatindra. Thank you, Professor, for the very interesting talk. I understand that information is also consolidated in the hands of a few ultra-rich. But how do you see the significance of the machinery by which the realm of information is being disrupted, called artificial intelligence? As Marx described machines of his time with all kinds of Gothic vocabulary, giant octopus with tentacles, etc., claiming that unlike tools, machines have their own rhythm, which they exert on their users. How do you see the role of AI in controlling the economics of information and its effects on democracy?
Yeah, this is uncharted territory. Let's be honest, I don't know. I really don't know. I do think, I think some of the hype about AI is a little overplayed. Maybe that's because it's still in its infancy, and the things that I have seen are often quite evidently wrong or foolish, or don't respond in the predicted ways and so on. But yes, there's no doubt that it has very significant potential. And in a way, there's this wonderful movie of Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times, in which this literally you show how the machine has determined the movement of the man, and he's doing this thing with the widgets and so when he comes out of the factory, he's still moving in that way because that's what he's been doing all day. And it's quite possible that something like that is going to happen to our minds, that in an incipient way, in a quiet way, without our even realizing it, that our minds will get attuned into responding and thinking in certain ways. It is possible. I don't know enough. I don't know whether this is likely to happen. That is certainly a doomsday scenario that many people have highlighted. Whether it is really that extreme is something that I find it hard to imagine, but maybe that's because it's a failure of my own imagination. Definitely it affects democracy. But listen, let's face it, we know that lots of things affect democracy. Rumor has always played a role in democracies and in changing electoral outcomes. Rumor is magnified by social media today, and fake news and the possibility of deep fakes within fake news, all of those have ultra magnified all of those impacts on democracy. So we're already in a world in which technology has dramatically altered the ways in which democracy functions. Whether AI is going to mean a quantum leap different from that, I don't know. But we are clearly in a world where access to information and the highly curated way in which now all of us get information and the ability of a few large media magnates to control that is definitely already playing a role. Musk played a huge role in the US election. The disinformation on Twitter was massive and was enabled and pushed by Trump, and it did play a role. So, all of that is already happening.
Next question is from Rajesh Ramakrishna. De-industrialization has become a reality in the advanced economies. Is it also happening in India? What is the role of rentier finance capital in causing this? How will this contradiction between rentier finance capital and productive industrial capital play out?
Again, a very good question. We saw under Biden the attempts to revive industry, right? The Inflation Reduction Act was really industrial policy under another name. It was a protectionist industrial policy, but it was industrial policy, all right. The European Green New Deal, exactly the same thing. The trade war with China is not about trade. It is a fight over who will dominate the technologies of the future, which is again about industrial policy. In India, I won't say we deindustrialize so much as we've had stalled industrialization. we stalled at a point where we hadn't really got into industrial country status, or we hadn't moved sufficiently in terms of diversifying our economy. And that stalled industrialization we can date from the early 1990s. In other words, it coincides with the period of neoliberal economic policies. And that's no surprise. Open markets in trade and capital will inevitably operate against those who are latecomers in industrialization. And that's something that anybody could have told the economic policymakers of the 1990s, and many of us did try to tell them, but we were disregarded. So India has had stalled industrialization for a long time. And the Make in India policies of Modi did not amount to industrial policy in the same way. It is possible to do industrial policy, but it has to be one that is much more focused on the entire value chain, particularly small, micro, and medium producers, which so far it hasn't. It's always about the big guys. We have industrial policy today. It's very much, as Balveer said, it's crony industrial policy. It's all about keeping the 2As and other large groups in enough money and profits and access to new markets as possible. We do not have an industrial policy that would permeate to the bulk of Indian producers. There is no reason why we shouldn't have it. There is nothing today in the world, because every other country is doing it. It's not as if we say, oh, we can't because globalization and the WTO and this and that. Everyone else is doing it. So if we're not doing it, it's because of our own failures in economic strategy. How does this fit in with the rentier capitalism? So here's the funny thing. We used to think of them as separate groups. It's no longer the case. Every large industrial group in India also runs finance companies. They also want to enter banking. They're also deeply involved in rentier capitalism in terms of extracting rents from privileged access, either to control over resources or toward particular government policies or whatever. So all of our capitalists today are rentiers. And that makes it even more complicated. That it makes it all the more reason why you have to actively incentivize industrial and productive activity, because the big guys are all rentiers. And if you look at their investments, they're dominantly financial investments nowadays. They're not real investments. So once again, you can't do it without the micro, small, and medium enterprises. And it's until we change that focus, we're not going to get a genuine, productive industrial policy.
There is a question from Amit Mishra. Do you have a take on the project of transforming the rational actor or citizen into a beneficiary?
I do. I think it's fundamentally undemocratic. I think the shift back again from a human rights-based economic agenda to one which sees it as a patronage relationship of the state, the Mai-Baap state, is a very regressive one. It's something that we hoped we had got away from in the 2000s, when we actually got rights-based legislation and so on. Unfortunately, there's been a regression, and we're back in that world where anything you get is a gift from Modi ji. And I think that's terrible.
There are a few questions which are different shades of the same question. I'm clubbing them together for your convenience. Broadly, they're asking, what would be the end game of capitalism as it exists today? Or either in a Scandinavian kind of a capitalism, or some kind of a science and technology innovations will make capitalism, its life difficult and force it to transform in some way. So how do you visualize its end game?
I can see capitalism transforming, and I can also see many varieties of capitalism emerging. I mean, I think there have always been varieties. I don't think there's always been only one capitalism, but although there's much, homogeneity now, much greater homogeneity now than there was even 20 years ago. But I do see different varieties of capitalism emerging. I would love to see post-capitalist economies emerging. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but I would love to see it, of course. But definitely I see varieties. And I think those varieties will come about precisely through the shifts that I was talking about. Changes in the regulatory structures, changes in the legal codes, that enable certain types of capitalism to flourish, changes in the responses of workers and civil society, and the ability of those groups to respond. And of course, control over information and media. I think all of those are absolutely critical in determining the kinds of new and more controlled capitalism. If you notice, I did say that democracy can only survive in controlled capitalism. I didn't necessarily say that it can only survive if there is no capitalism, because I don't think that's true. I think you can get democracies in controlled capitalism, but how you can control them is also a function of the kind of democracy you get.
Professor Anji Reddy has raised a question in the chat box. I will request him to unmute and share his question. Professor Anji Reddy.
My question is, what do you think of, what is your views on socialist democracy, like a Scandinavian model, or what Bernie Sanders proposes? I just want to hear your views on it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think these are all different varieties of controlled or managed capitalism. I'm all for them. They're infinitely better than what we have today, for sure. These are varieties of controlled capitalism. It is not suppressing the fundamental urge. I mean, it's recognizing the fundamental urges of capitalism, but trying to control or suppress them in a way that is minimally compatible with a broader social good. In all of this, by the way, we haven't mentioned the possibility of the climate absolutely changing beyond. I mean, we are at very close to tipping points. And I should have also mentioned that along with all social goals, we have to bear in mind the planetary goals. Because whatever else we know capitalism is doing, one thing we know for sure is that it's destroying the planet. So that also has to be borne in mind when we're thinking about the controls on capitalism.
Can you take up Anji Reddy's question?
Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
Please.
There is a comment and a request for your response from Professor Anji Reddy. The problem between capitalism and democracy is related to the idea of legitimacy. Unless the institutions of the state derive legitimacy from the public as they are continually delegitimized by the capital, capitalism cannot be transcended by the labor. And the labor transcends from identity politics. It cannot raise structural questions of capitalism. Can you respond?
You know, I increasingly have a more, what shall I say? I have a more flexible view on this. Because if I put all these really severe conditions, I don't think we're ever going to get any real change. I mean, let's face it, we're in a really terrible world. And we have many, many countries, perhaps the majority of the world's population, being controlled by very authoritarian rulers. Some are in supposedly electoral democracies, some in openly not democracies, but that's the majority of the global population. And if I say that, you know, everybody has to change before we get any positive change, it's not going to happen. So I have a more nuanced approach. I'm really thinking thin end of the wedge in every case. I'm thinking of how we can make shifts that create a momentum for bigger and wider changes. So I would say that that these forms of managed capitalism, controlled capitalism, are definitely much better than unmanaged, deregulated, completely uncontrolled hyper capitalism of the kind that we're experiencing. I would say we should support everybody who does that. And we can't say, well, you know, until you as the working class also change and stop thinking about this and that, we're not going to be with you, because we don't have that luxury anymore. We can't say, oh, you're a white worker who voted for Trump because he's white instead of Kamala, so I'm not going to have anything to do with you. We can't say that. We can't tell a majoritarian Hindu that, you know, if you're against Muslims, there's no way I'm ever going to be part of anything you do, because we don't have that luxury anymore. We have to be thinking of the things that provide a common united front. And unfortunately, yeah, we have to go back to united front politics in every country now, because there is very little other option, let's face it.
Meenu Gundevia has raised one question in the chat box. I will request her to unmute and share the question. Minu Gundeviya, please.
Thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed the talk. It was very insightful and profound. But my question is this: how will the trade war between USA and China, USA and Europe and other countries affect capitalism? That's it. And will there be China and USA especially, they are going to have a lot of problem. And the other thing that's happening is that the globalization is in decline. Now everybody's turning inward. There was a very good article in The Guardian about this, thoroughly analytical. That's the first question. The second question is, China is not a democratic state as the USA and Europe. What is the role of Chinese government vis-a-vis private property, profit, and capitalism?
These are both very good questions. On the US-China trade war, I'm going to stick out my neck and say US has already lost the trade war. Okay? This was a war on technology. China is miles ahead on most of the green technologies of the future and on AI, on artificial intelligence, which they got into earlier. It is also much more aggressively investing and ensuring all the value chains for the production of things that involve the green transition. And it has learned how to circumvent the US. You know, Biden thought that when he was putting a ban on Huawei and not letting them have access to the latest NVIDIA chips, that he was going to destroy them forever. Within 1.5 years, they had come back with a better chip. I mean, it's terrifying the extent to which they can actually generate the technologies because they are willing to put, let me put it this way. China is an example of very efficiently managed capitalism. Okay, it is managed capitalism. There's no question about it. I mean, let's not call it socialism for a moment, but it is very efficiently managed capitalism with much more overt state control. There is covert state control in other countries. This is overt. What is the Chinese government? Of course, it's authoritarian, and of course, it's not democratic, but it nevertheless has a need for legitimacy. And I think we have known this about authoritarian governments. Even the South Korean military rulers, you know, they needed legitimacy. They had to keep ensuring real wages rising. So you can do it either through complete military control, as the dictatorships in Latin America did, where you basically eliminate any opposition, and you make them, you disappear them and so on. Or you do it through some grant of ensuring legitimacy. Erdogan is doing the same thing in terms of, you know, or Orban in Hungary. They actually try and ensure some minimum social welfare for those whom define as citizens, not for the others, but for them, and rising real wages for them. So for a sufficiently large segment of the population, they ensure some legitimacy. And this means that while the Chinese government is extremely oppressive, repressive, and dictatorial, and where political enemies of Xi Jinping are got after without mercy and so on, specific protests are often responded to. Some are suppressed, but some are actually responded to. And so the Chinese government is a peculiar thing. It's obviously not democratic in terms of, you know, the usual electoral democratic thing, but it does have some perception of retaining legitimacy. So it's a complicated thing. Were there more questions?
Yeah. Marco, please. There are two questions from Ashwath wants to know, is existing left ideas are strong enough to counter this new liberalism? If yes, why it is so unpopular? And how to find new left intellectuals to take on this challenge? And Alok Tandon wants to know whether the whole idea of socialism is dead. So two related questions, you can take them together.
Okay, let me begin with the second one. I don't believe the idea of socialism is dead at all, but I think we have to have a much more nuanced approach to socialism. I mean, for example, I'm going to say, just like I've said varieties of capitalism, I'm going to say varieties of socialism. I don't think For example, the old 20th century idea of the centralized state with centralized planning, with top-down policies, etc., and the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. I don't think that flies anymore. I don't think that has any resonance anywhere, honestly. That means that those of us who consider ourselves to be socialists have to recognize other identities. Now, here's the thing. Here I've been saying, identity politics, etc., not a solution. But one big problem the left had and continues to have in many mainstream left parties and unions and so on is the lack of recognition of the other identities. I mean, women, for example, really, the left in India has been pretty bad on women for quite a long time. The caste, which for a long time we pretended wasn't a thing in India. And, it just was by accident that all of the state committees of every left party in every state just happened to be Brahmins or upper castes in general and so on. So we tended to underplay a lot of those identities. We tended to believe in democratic centralism, which really just meant centralism. It didn't necessarily mean accountability of the leadership to its own mass base and so on. We tended, I would say, to again believe in very centralized economic policies without thinking about the ways in which this could play out with what the Europeans call subsidiarity. I think, a kind of extended version of what Balbir was calling federalism. But we need to think much more about those. We need to stop worshipping the large. In economics, left intellectuals, socialist intellectuals have always worshipped the large because we believed in central planning. We believe in, the large enterprises, the economies of scale of those, in contradistinction to the atomized private competition and so on. So we have to change a lot of those things. But of course, we can't change them in exactly the same way in every social context. So, this is going to sound very heretical, but I have become a believer in varieties of socialism, just as we recognize that there are varieties of capitalism. And I think the way forward for us, even in India, has got to be socially based within that particular context. And since India is such a large heterogeneous country, that means that something that is going to fly in Tamil Nadu may not be the same as what you would need in Assam. And so really, I think, maybe we need to have a more, and I think this is particularly important if we want to attract the young. For me, a big tragedy is that we've attracted relatively few young people. I think the ones we have attracted are amazing. I am in awe, for example, of our students in JNU. I'm absolutely in awe of their courage, integrity, intelligence, everything. But broadly speaking, we haven't done enough, I think, to attract the younger generation.
There is one more question. Probably this is the last question in the chat box. If new questions don't pop up, maybe this is the last question.
Yeah.
How do you visualize this? Is there is no name, there is only phone name. How do you visualize BRICS against American SWIFT alternative to China will lead?
Globally, globally there is a decline of the US. And I think this leads to another, this relates to another question. Did I see it in the chat or did we talk about it earlier? So you see, look, the US is already losing the trade war with China. There's no question. But Trump is not somebody, he talked about trade war, but he doesn't want to rule the world. Trump is, Walden Bello described him as a spheres of influence guy. He believes in spheres of influence. So he's going to make sure Latin America, the US backyard is, he's going to really fix them. So Cuba, Venezuela, etc., they're in for a very rough time. But he will probably tell China, okay, you can have, East and Southeast Asia. You do what you like, basically. I think he's probably that kind of guy. And it's, in a way, it's fitting for an empire in decline to be doing that. It's not a stupid thing to do in that sense. BRICS is one way of coping with a US regime that was still pretending that it ruled the world, or still had the illusion that it ruled the world. You can put sanctions against Iran and Venezuela. You can freeze their assets in your country. You can do all that. You do that to Russia. That is a very big message. It means that you can do this to anybody. So we've seen central banks across the world thinking of alternative currency arrangements, alternative trading, alternative holding of reserves. Because if US, and then US will tell Europe, which will do its bidding, decide that they don't like you anymore, then a lot of bad things can happen. So everybody is doing what you could call self-insurance. And that self-insurance is something that takes many different forms. I think BRICS Plus is one of those forms. And remember, a lot of them are really nasty regimes. They are not likable in the least. Yeah, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. They are pretty disgusting authoritarian regimes themselves. But they are geopolitically and economic, in terms of economic strategy, they are necessarily looking for alternatives, partly for survival and partly because they don't see the scope for expansion with the G7 in the same way as they used to. And so we are going to see much more of these. I think the BRICS system is called CLEAR, which is, but the actual alternative to SWIFT hasn't yet been developed, but they do have a new exchange system, which is called BRICS CLEAR, which I think is going to become much more important. And we're going to get many more. I think there will be actually pressures to institutionalize many more BRICS activities. At the moment, the only institution they have is the New Development Bank. But I think there will be pressures now to actually institutionalize many more BRICS activities. The development of central bank digital currencies is going to be a very big player in this regard. I think it's going to actually, not game changer, but it's certainly going to shift the terrain in terms of a lot of international economic transactions.
Subhash, if I can come in for, I'm sorry.
Yes, please. Yes, of course, Ravi.
I'm sorry to come with a second question, but I was I can't stop myself after you referred to Mukul Keshwan's metaphor of Jekyll and Hyde. And that kind of thing kind of makes me very uneasy. The question I asked myself that does left or progressives as well as progressive liberals, do they try to unseat Modi through electoral process or not? Or should the Democratic Party, should it not have tried hard to stop Trump, which it did? But when you call Jekyll and Hyde, then I feel uneasy, because if you blame, for example, in India, you say that Rahul is not strong enough, or Congress and BJP are Jekyll and Hyde. If you say in US, Democrats, of Biden variety and so on, and Trump, they are Jekyll and Hyde, then what are we telling ourselves? Is there another option to electorally defeat Modi or electorally defeat Trump? So that's one thing, I am uneasy with this equating them, because I think we on left cannot defeat Modi. So we have to take help we have to support those people who have a good chance of defeating Modi and who are not exactly, 100% we can like them or they are up to our standards. But we don't have an option. We have to go with them in order to defeat Modi, and similar things will be true for US. I today heard Professor Michael Sandel of Harvard University on the TV, and he was criticizing Democratic Party for saying that if you say to the Midwest or high school or the working people who have not gone to college, if you tell them that if you get a college degree, then you can make a good life for yourself. He was making the point that even if they were to accept that, they will find it very condescending, as if the thing is being put on them. Also, some other people have in US context made the case that there is too much of political correctness and too much of underlining the minority identity, so that the majority white population feels that, oh, I can't even speak my mind, or I can't even use my language, all that he, she, they kind of, how should we be called, or other, minorities being underlined. So there are plethora of questions on which Democratic Party in US and Rahul Gandhi in India, they are being criticized, and I feel uneasy that they are the hope how we can defeat the autocrats or fascists or whatever you call it. So this Jekyll and Hyde metaphor, I feel uneasy with, and I would like your comment on that.
Okay, I think first I should clarify, and if you read Mukul's article, you will be very clear. He is talking about US vis-a-vis the rest of the world, specifically the developing world. And there I actually completely agree with him. I think the Biden administration vis-a-vis the rest of the world and the Trump administration vis-a-vis the rest of the world, except insofar as he emboldens people like Modi. But other than that, in terms of economic and geopolitical strategy, they are not different. So that is, and that's really the sense in which Mukul is talking about it. Okay. So that, I think, it's not about the internal policies. On the other part, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm all for United Front. I mean, I think, come on, we were all desperately supporting and doing everything we could for the India alliance, and we will continue to do so. So I don't think there is any debate about that. I think, especially in India, we know the qualitative difference between those who at least recognize democracy and those who use the powers that electoral democracy give them to undermine it. So there is absolutely no debate about that. The Jekyll and Hyde analogy is essentially about the fact that the US is fundamentally an imperialist nation, has behaved in that way for the past 80 years or so, and that, we kid ourselves if we think that a change in that regime, however unpleasant it may be for the people in the US, is going to be a huge change in its approach outside. What Mukul described it is what the Biden administration did is to make it look respectable. But let us face it, what has been happening, what Israel has been not just allowed, but enabled and encouraged and assisted to do in Gaza and Palestine and now in Lebanon is unspeakable, right? And it's not going to be different with Trump. If anything, it'll be a bit faster, but it's, slow death versus quick death. It's not that the US government has been particularly nice about what's going on in the Middle East. In fact, if anything, they were more aggressive about Taiwan. China is much less likely to be aggressive about Taiwan and so on, and other wars. So I think that Jekyll and Hyde comparison was essentially about the US role globally, and which frankly I completely agree with. But your other point that yes, we have to combine in a united front, I think is absolutely essential. But that does not mean that we don't recognize the mistakes that were made, even in a united front. I mean, I don't know what will happen in Maharashtra if, in fact, the BJP manages to get its way, which, God knows it possibly will. There will be accusations, recriminations, and concerns and mistakes pointed out. That's part of the game that we have to recognize. And we also have to be willing to hear those criticisms. I don't think we can say that talk truth to power to everybody except when it's us. So I think Bernie Sanders has been very critical. Bernie Sanders actually came and said, we should not be surprised that a party, that the Democratic Party that abandoned the working class has been abandoned by them. So it's fair. I mean, those are necessary criticisms for course correction. So I don't think this means that either Bernie or Michael Sandel or anybody else is going to say, yeah, now vote with Trump. It means that, yes, we have a united front, but we have a united front in which we recognize the mistakes and we try and ensure that it doesn't happen again.
We get called Professor Shahid. Can you unmute yourself and share your question? Shahid, please.
Thank you very much, Subhash. This has been very educational for me. My background is engineering. I am totally unschooled in the subject, except in a general way. So I have a couple of questions. One very specific. In your talk, you talked about the market of capitalism and it was collapsing. I think you meant the demand is going down, so it is the market for the products of, I don't want to call it products of capitalism, I want to call it products of labor, which is appropriated by capital. But in addition to that, there is a market for capitalism or capital, market for capital, which is such a commodification of, and Marx has called it reification of money. And, today that commodification has become so common that we buy and sell health, education, happiness. Everything has become a commodity to be bought and sold. But all of this has been talked about for a long number of years and does not seem to have made an impact. So my bigger question is, what is the communication process that we can employ that will become a little more effective than we have seen? Because communalization, otherization has been extremely effective. So what is the communication tool that will face this onslaught?
Yeah, these are very big and important questions. Thank you. But yes, you're absolutely right. When I said domestic market, that's a term we economists use for demand. It is a proxy for demand. So yes, absolutely correct. The market for capital. Yes, what you're describing is really what we today call financialization. Essentially, the intermediation of finance into everything. And finance is another market that has been created by capitalism, just like the market for intellectual property. Capitalism is incredibly fertile in creating new markets. And it has to, because it kind of sucks up the earlier ones. It kind of diminishes their ability to generate demand. And therefore, it has to keep creating new markets, and it does. So the privatization of utilities, water becomes a commodity, the privatization of health that you talk about, and so on and so forth. All of these create markets. So absolutely. And finance is the biggest player in this. We now have, in fact, the financialization of money, the payment apps. It's the financialization of finance, if you like, which is another level altogether. So yes, absolutely. How do we communicate all this? I increasingly find that I'm not good at this. I'm good at this only with a very select range of people. So we have to rely on the people who are really the good communicators. And I find there are some. I mean, I don't know how many, Kanhaiya Kumar, who was a student of ours, he's a brilliant communicator. And he is able to capture the essence of many of our arguments like that in this very earthy, bihari, on the ground way that people can relate to. And there are others. I have seen some of, there's this young man in Uttar Pradesh, I've forgotten his name. There are some really brilliant communicators out there. I don't think the problem, I don't think we have, certainly I personally don't have that capacity. What I can do is feed them stuff that might help. But they are the ones who can. And the young are also better at thinking of different ways of communicating. They are, first of all, they're much more adept at social media. Secondly, I think, I don't know if this is general, but my generation, I find we get depressed very easily. We think, oh my God, it's all over there. These kids have grown up in this terrible world. And having grown up in it, if they are able to face it, they are actually much better able to deal with it than we are. And they're better able to navigate that. So I really have a lot of hope in some of these people in the younger generation. I mentioned earlier, we haven't attracted enough of them. But, as I said, some of them, I am in absolute awe of them, of their brilliance, their courage, their integrity, and their ability to communicate. And I really think that these are not, you can't keep good people down forever. It's not going to end like this. It's actually going to get better because there are those people out there who are able to work this system much better than we can, because we're not used to this. We're these softies who grew up in this lovely liberal Nehruvian world, and we are not used to the rough and tumble of this ghastly new world that we have created. But they have grown up in it, and yet they are able to deal with it. So frankly, having said a lot of depressing things, I actually still have a lot of hope, even in terms of communicating.
I think with this note, we should conclude this important speech. What I found interesting is that the depressing scenario which we keep talking about, Jayati underlined the possibility, the resources of hope, and she talked about varieties of socialism. So she tried to put forward a new vision for our times. So many thanks for this speech. And I would like to tell the participants that our next speaker is Professor Balbir Arora, 5th January.
Oh.
He'll be here on Democracy Dialogue. So let's with this note, let's call it a day. Thank you, Jayati, for joining.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.